Hey, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, hi, welcome. Glad you're here. Hope you stay. I am so excited for today's video. I'm going to be walking you through the brand new Retro palette by Natasha Denona. I have the mini Retro palette, and that is probably my favorite mini of all of her mini palettes. So when I saw that the larger Retro was being released, I knew that I had to have it. I did pre-order this palette off of the Natasha Denona website when it became available for pre-order, and I received it today. I'm filming all of this today because I just cannot wait. I am really excited to show you the looks that I created. My ultimate goal was to use every single shade in the palette, which across the 4 looks I was able to do. The first look corresponds with the first row, the second look with the second row, and the third look corresponds with the third row, and then the fourth look, which is the one that I'm wearing on my eyes right now, I just went into any shades that were really grabbing my attention. I'll be giving you my first impressions and initial review at the end of the video. I'll have detailed timestamps listed down below in the description box in case you wanted to skip ahead to anything, but with all of that out of the way, let's get into the video. For this first look, I used the top row of the palette. Starting off with the shade Vivian on my Smith 232, I applied that to the crease. I did try to build this up, but couldn't get as much payoff as I was looking for. Next, going in with the shade Andy on the Rephr 15 brush, trying to build the depth in the outer corner as well as the crease. Next, I applied the shade Jude on my eyelid, and then on top of that I applied the shade Glitz, and then I used Mod as a brow bone and inner corner highlight. For the second look, I created a halo eye. First, I went in with the shade Go-Go in the crease in the outer and inner corners. Then I used the shade Patty to deepen up the outer and inner corners. Lastly, I used the shade Groove, mainly in the outer corner and a very tiny bit on the inner corner to build the depth. And the shade Psychedelic I've placed in the middle of the halo eye. I used the shade Apart to line the lash line. For the third look, I went in with the shade Nude Mauve in the crease. Then the shade Amara in the outer third and the crease. And the shade Rebellion to continue deepening up the outer corner. I then took the shade Helio over my eyelid and the shade Swing in the outer third. For the fourth look, I used the shade Nude Mauve as a transition shade. I used the shade Patty to deepen up the outer third and the crease. In the middle of my eye, I used the shade Vivian, and then on the inner third of my eye, I used the shade Mod. Then I went in with the shade Amara to continue building up the depth in the outer corner. Then the shade Apart to line the lashes, and to blend that out, I used the shade Groove to just deepen that up right in the outer third. Before getting into my initial thoughts, I do want to go over some of the basics. First, this palette is one of her midi size, so you get the 15 shades, and they come in a variety of finishes and textures. There's one shade which is Glitz that comes in a duochrome, and there's one shade that comes in her chrome formula, which is Psychedelic. Otherwise, the other finishes are Metallic, Creamy Mattes, and her Cream to Powder formula. There is a mini version of this palette called the Mini Retro palette, which has been on the market for some time. Honestly, when I'm looking at the two palettes next to each other, I don't see how they are meant to complement each other. The other full sizes that have mini versions seem to be more encompassing of the overall theme of those larger palettes, but I don't see that in the palettes where the minis came first. Moving on though, I want to include some swatches of the Retro palette as well as the Mini Retro palette. I swatched these on my arm as well as my husband's arm. I thought it would be helpful to swatch these on his arm since he is quite a bit deeper than I am, and I thought having the shades swatched on our two skin tones would be helpful. Now getting into my initial thoughts. I originally was only interested in picking this palette up because it was a blown up version of the Retro palette, and because I was such a big fan of that palette, I really thought that I would get a lot of enjoyment out of the larger version. That said, I don't really see how this palette is retro. I guess to me, the colors in the Mini Retro palette scream retro, definitely give me the retro vibe, but when I'm looking at the shades in this larger palette, I can see kind of where the shades were going, but when I'm looking at this, it really is just reminding me of a cool tone version of the Love palette, or it's just a complementary palette to the Glam palette. It's just giving you a little bit more mauve and purple tones to work with, but for me, it's not retro enough to be called the Retro palette. Color story aside, the formulas in here are pretty on par with what I would expect from Natasha Denona. The creamy mattes perform very well. I'm not a fan of her creamy powder formula or her cream to powder formula. That just doesn't do it for me the way that I know some people really like it. I do prefer her more traditional matte formula. I love her shimmer shades. I love the special shades that she includes in these palettes. And while I'm happy that this palette is more matte shades than shimmer, the way that the Glam palette was heavily shimmer shades and the Bronze palette was heavily shimmer shades, I'm really happy that this has more matte tones, but they're mainly just that cream to powder formula that I don't really enjoy working with, so it's kind of like a trade-off of what you're willing to work with within your palette. I enjoyed working with the matte shades. They blended out the same as they have in past palettes. I really like the shimmer shades. I didn't notice any hard panning from swatching and the multiple eye looks that I created. I do think that some perform better than others or have more impact than some of the other ones do within the palette, so I definitely have shades that I'm more likely to gravitate towards. One thing I thought was really interesting about this palette and receiving it in real life is how different it looks compared to the photos that I saw of it online. I think that the shades on the internet are very misleading to the tones that you get in real life with this palette. The photos definitely don't do the metallic shades justice. The metallic shades are so stunning, and the depth and the reflectiveness that they have when you swatch them is something that I do feel is quite special to Natasha Denona. I don't think anyone does shimmer or metallic shades the way that she does. Personal preference wise, I do think that I would have preferred if the palette looked a little bit more like the Mini Retro palette. Otherwise, to me, this does look very similar to the Glam palette with some purple thrown into it. I don't necessarily think that if you own other palettes from her that you need to run out and pick this up. I do think that if you own the Biba palette, you do have these tones and shades pretty covered from what's available in that palette, so I don't necessarily think that you need to own both. If you are someone who's looking to buy a Natasha Denona palette for the first time and this color story really speaks to you, I think that you might like it. Again, I don't like the cream to powder formula as much as I prefer her other formulas. So for me, with it being so heavily reliant on that formula, this is one that if I were a casual consumer, I would pass on. But if this is something that you're really drawn to and you know you're going to get a lot of use out of it, I do think you may find a lot of enjoyment in using this palette. The colors are very wearable. I think that it is very easy to figure out how to put a look together. Part of why Natasha Denona's color stories are the way that they are is that she's designed them to be workable across and down and in quads. She's made it so that you can easily create a look with as few shades as you want to use or as many shades as you want to use. As far as my personal ranking for this palette among the rest of the Natasha Denona palettes that I have, I think this one will fall somewhere in the bottom end, but not the bottom. I do have one palette that is the bottom of my Natasha Denona palettes, and it would be pretty hard to beat that one as my bottom place palette, but I think this one will probably fall one above, maybe two above that one. I do love the bronze palette. I love the Biba palette. I do have shades that I gravitate towards more than other shades, but as for comprehensive palettes, this one just doesn't really speak to me the way that I thought it would when I was imagining what it would be like when I used it. I was very excited prior to putting the eyeshadows on my eyes. I had a lot of inspiration. I was really excited for the looks that I could create. But then once I was applying all the shades to my eyes, I kind of ran out of that steam of inspiration that I, going into this, was so excited about. I was trying to figure out what kind of looks I was going to create. I had the shades that I was really excited to use, and then once I started applying them, so many of them look the same on the eyes that I just kind of didn't want to continue playing. I sat here and I made my eye looks, and they're fine. I'm not unhappy with the eye looks, but from what I've created with other palettes, this one just doesn't excite me as much as like the bronze palette or the Biba palette still does, and I've had that palette for years and I still am getting excited to use that one whenever I take it out. This one I feel like was lackluster on my expectations for it, but I am going to continue playing around with it and mixing up some of the shades. I'm going to try pairing it with some other Natasha Denona palettes that I have, and even some non-Natasha Denona palettes that I have, and see if I can create any looks that I am really wowed by and really excited about. I will have a roundup video coming up in the near future, so hopefully I will have some updated thoughts to include in that video on this palette after I've had a chance to play around with it some more. Let me know what you think. Did you like the looks that I created? Were you planning on picking this palette up? Should I do more videos like this where I do multiple looks using one palette? Definitely let me know down below. Anyway, that's going to be all from me today. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you have any other videos you'd like to see from me, definitely let me know down below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today, and I will catch you again very soon in my next video.